ahead. It's 2 minutes past by my watch, so let's go ahead and get started. Others can file in as they come on. So for everyone joining us, welcome. This is my name is David Sturtz. I'm partner with Cooperative Strategies, working with Mary Filardo here from the National Council on School Facilities and 21st Century Fund. We've been collaborating now. This is our 5th webinar, and we're in a series where we are looking at creating guidance with users who are in the field trying to do this work, as Jeff was mentioning from Huntsville. You know, how do we determine our capacity moving forward? What are some of the operational considerations? How do we do busing? How do we do cleaning? What's a guidance to make our strategy? So there's a lot of tactical guidance out there for very specific things, and what we see missing and what we're trying to do here as a group is to put together a strategy document that folks can pick up and walk through and use to personalize it and make that happen by the fall to open as you see fit and what meets your needs in the different variables that you have to contend with. So that's our overarching goal. And we'll do a sort of a overview of what we've established to date and what our key objectives are. Key objectives for every meeting is to first, we want to share some updates on federal funding that's going to impact states and local educational agencies related to COVID. So every week, Mary has her finger on this pulse and will give us a little bit of update here as that comes in. Second, we want to create and share tools that can help track incurred expected costs. We have some budget worksheet that we're going to talk about today, and then next week we'll deliver a dynamic one with an Excel that you can use to plug in some different parameters and come up with your expected costs for your district on a per pupil basis to address operating with COVID related expenses on top of your day-to-day. And then thirdly, here, developing the guidance as mentioned for reopening. What does it look like to develop capacity for your students, and what does it look like in your building? And once you've exhausted space considerations for your capacity on your site, including outside your building, then we look at how do you work with time. So today we are looking to show a update where we are on the budgeting, and we're getting close. We need your feedback after we send out this next document. We're going to get close on capacity, give it a little more detail than last week, and walk through some further steps there. And then next week, we want to send you that updated budget document, finalize the capacity guidance discussion, and move into scheduling. So that is our webinar agenda, which I got a little ahead of myself on, but there we go. Mary, do you want to take it from here?
Yeah, thanks, David. This is Mary Filardo, and thank you all for joining us today. There's just a brief legislative update that I'll give you in a second. But one of the things we would love for folks to put into the chat is what are the operational issues that are most keeping you up at night? I mean, part of what we're trying to do in collecting guidance and looking at what's happening really all over the world associated with reopening schools or managing schools in a health crisis is make sure that we're paying attention to what folks who have to own, who operate schools, what they're worried about. So if you can, share that with us, it's really helpful to make sure that we're on the right track here. David and Paul Mills from Canon Design are going to walk through another way and approach to analyzing corona capacity, and then Paul's got a really nifty tool that will be provided to everyone. And as David said, we are going to look at budget. We're trying to get our heads around the cost of operating in this very different environment, even operating and closing, depending upon what arises in communities. What in our last meeting, folks asked us to go a little bit longer so that we might have more time to break up into groups. And so what we're going to do at the top of the hour we'll finish with sort of the presentation part of the program, and then we'll break into groups, you know, as I say at the top of the hour. If it's a little bit early, that's fine. You know, if people have to jump off, we certainly understand, but those who can stay and give us their individual feedback, it's really helpful, and we would really appreciate it. So essentially what the tools we're looking at is the budgeting worksheet, kind of going forward. Next, in the sessions that come up, we're going to be looking at scheduling options, and then collecting together some of the cleaning protocols and some of the hygiene protocols, and those have to do with the personal hygiene that we are understanding to be recommended in the schools. So we put a lot on our plate. Sometimes I'm sorry, but I know that it's a lot less than our school people are having to deal with. So I shouldn't complain. So what's happening now, I mean, of course, it's a bit of a mess out here, as we all know, partly because the economy is taking such a hit. And with the economy, that means that our governmental entities are really struggling because they obviously depend upon the public having jobs and making money in order to be supported. So while there have already been a number of packages that have gone primarily to individuals and to businesses, there was a little bit already, about $13.5 billion that's gone to K-12 education. But there's a very strong push to try to bring some other relief into K-12 education and university as well, as Pam is so close to. And what's on the table now, although there's a sense that it's not necessarily going to go anywhere, is $3 trillion in the HEROES Act, which the Democratic House is proposed. There's $100 billion in there for education, about $90 billion for elementary, secondary, and 10 plus a little for university. And on the K-12 side, it's really designed to try to make up for many of the new costs that districts are assuming because of COVID, but also I think to compensate for huge cuts in state revenues and local revenues that are anticipated. So I'm not gonna read through this. It's pretty flexible. And it's not there yet. So, but we're tracking it. And one of the reasons the budget work that we're doing is so important is that there's not really a very good understanding of the costs that districts and states are assuming under the COVID environment. So this is partly what they are needing from us. And so hopefully, you know, together we'll be able to get a better sense of that to share with decision makers. Yeah, let's keep going. We've got some basic assumptions, and to a large extent, it's that there's some tension between health, education, and the economy, and that it's the guidance is really designed to help us navigate it responsibly, and with good data, good information, and good engagement with our public. So I'm not going to read those, but I think that that's an important thing to understand, that there's some tension here, but the states are obligated to provide universal public education. Our health officials have got to do and recommend what they can to keep us safe. And frankly, we need to have a productive economy, and we need to be able to be out there working and kind of making life happen in order to support all of us. So it's a very tricky needle to thread, and no one's really certain how this goes, but we think we need to be ready, you know, with education as best we can to meet the health requirements and support a working economy. David?
Okay, yeah, and thanks to everybody who's put their questions and concerns, comments in the group chat. That's part of what we wanted to do with that question is to record it and then look at our the guidance documents and look at it. What gaps do we have that we're not addressing some of these concerns? So appreciate all that's very helpful. Okay. So first of all, what's the therefore? What are we trying to do with a COVID capacity, corona capacity, modified capacity, call it what you will? We are trying to limit exposure within groups to prevent a person who is infected from transmitting the virus to others, while trying to limit exposure between groups so that if or when a person presents symptoms, the fewest groups of students and staff will need to self-isolate so that ideally you don't shut down a whole school when you have a case. You are able to take a group or groups to a distance learning option temporarily while the remainder can continue in the setting. Why? So that we can fulfill our obligation to provide a quality universal public education, which the assumption is that to be quality and universal, it can only be digital for so long, and that is definitely a stopgap. If we can educate people in 3 dimensions, we want to do that if we can do it safely. And so that's sort of what we're aiming at. Quick math, you've seen this before in the previous slides, and what's the starting point? Well, the starting point in looking at different models, and there are different ones, and my good friend and partner in a lot of planning work for years, Paul Mills with Canon, is going to help me out with some of these exercises, these slides here coming up. But you start with basically taking a cut of 60% of your capacity. That's a first whack at your capacity. You then want to declutter the rooms insofar as possible, because what matters for social distancing is the usable space, not just necessarily the wall-to-wall space. You want to be able to spread out as much as you can. You want to then identify those current instructional spaces that get capacity modeling at least 44 square feet per student of usable space. As you'll see in the coming slides, we're really looking at from 44 as a min, around 40 as a min, up to about 100, depending on some different assumptions that we have. And we'll give you actually a spreadsheet that will help model that, that Paul has created, which is fantastic. And we're going to identify all rooms that could be potentially used for assigned instructional space that currently aren't. For example, art rooms in elementary schools, cafeterias, media centers, these spaces aren't used for capacity by and large, but they could be if need be. And so we're going to show an updated slides on how to perform that exercise. And then if at that point your current plus potential corona capacity is not sufficient, then you look at moving time. We want to first look at what can we do with the space before we start changing schedules, as that has a lot of trickle-down challenges and implications. So we take a couple slides here and we give it to Paul. Paul's going to talk about what are the different assumptions that you need to consider when you look at these numbers, because there are numbers flying out there. Our number at 44, you see numbers over 100. Some people are saying it's absolutely 60 square feet a kid. Well, there's some assumptions behind that, why there's differences. So Paul's going to go through what those assumptions are so you can make it right for you. And then we're going to go into how to apply that to the building.
Hi, everybody. I'm Paul Mills with Canon Design. I'm calling you from Southwest New Hampshire by way of Texas, where I live most of the year. So raise your hand, since I can't see everybody, if you find the CDC's guidelines traceable and actionable, or even binding, right? There's a lot of ambiguity there in terms of what 6 feet spacing is. And actually I keep hearing 6 feet or 2 meters, which is 6.5 feet. So we're 6 inches into peril already, right? Right now you're hearing a lot of numbers being thrown around, and a lot of people have initially grabbed towards a 6-foot grid of desks if you're talking about a classroom type space, right? Which would be nose to nose. Nobody moves an inch or else you're encroaching on someone else's space. Should we create some sort of buffer in there for personal space? For instance, like a 9-foot grid would allow 3 feet of reasonable space for a human being to actually be 6 feet apart from the other human beings. adjacent to them. These are the sorts of things that we've been modeling in doing design thinking around, okay, how can we create some tools that'll be helpful for consideration of reopening? So here's what a socially distanced classroom might look like. Applying that 9-foot grid modeling, here is a standard California classroom at 960 feet, which would accommodate about 11 students. You could probably get in a fourth row of 4 human beings into the room if it weren't for the fixed furnishings, which need to be accounted for in most classroom spaces. So what we've done is we've created a parametric model based on that, where you can plug in the variables that are relevant to you and the size of the classrooms that are relevant to you to account for Jack Black, who needs to have his space to teach your students, and perhaps maybe even another spot for a special ed monitor or volunteers or parents, teacher aides that are part of the program. And so you can dial in on seeing what's going on. So we can see in the little thumbnail there is there's a spreadsheet we'll post into the chat that actually it's validated by my 7th grader and 9th grader who are steeped in geometry here, that it's confirmed to be factual. But what are the limits, min, max, of mathematically, how many human beings could you fit into the space given the parameters that you can place in that would be relevant to you? And you can use that as a tool, not to make the decisions for you, but just one of many, many data sets to understand how you do spatial temporal modeling in a way that is responsible to your stakeholders.
Yeah.
So if you look at this one chart here, it's different permutations of kind of the downward going arrow. That nose-to-nose spacing, 6-foot grid modeling looks pretty normal. This is the example of the 960 square foot classroom here, where getting in average about 26 students, depending on the relative dimensions that comprise that space. You're getting upwards towards what's normal and pretty good. That, of course, means you're modifying the space and using as much of the floor plan as you can. But as far as capacity, it feels okay. But if you start to accommodate for a little bit of movement and wanting to respect the 6.5 feet, 6 feet, whatever we're going to call it, CDC guidelines, that you're starting to kick up towards 100 square feet. And if you're looking at 3 feet personal space thrown on top.
Thanks, Paul. So that's really what we wanted to show here, and Paul volunteered to create this spreadsheet and share it with everybody so you could plug in your assumptions of how much additional personal space on top of the 6 foot do we want to add. And that's a decision based upon a risk assessment. That's a decision based upon the risk of not having kids in school versus the risk of having them in the rooms, and how many rooms do you have available. And there's lots of factors, but that's why you're seeing different numbers is the assumptions of space are a little bit different. And that's where we kind of started in that 44 range, was accounting for a little wiggle room for the teacher on top of that. So that's where you get that, that's tracking with what we see here. And then you just add different dimensions on that to see what works for you based upon the different size of the classroom. And when you see in the spreadsheet, it'll show you, hey, for a 700 square foot classroom, your min, max, and average capacity is going to be, A, B, C. And for a 900, it's going to be DEF. It's going to be different based upon the size of the room for you. But that's just the start, as mentioned. And thanks, Paul. Yeah, Paul, go ahead and finish this up, and then we'll get into applying it to the space.
Sure, and this builds on some of the stuff that we've been talking about over the weeks in this forum, and probably one-to-one dialogues you're having with you and your stakeholders. But the notion of time and space schedule is something, a lever after you've exhausted your spatial constraints. Time is the other way you can go. A couple other things just to call out. Obviously, you want to reclaim as much space in other areas that maybe aren't the highest and best use isn't there when you have instructional needs. But teacher collaboration suites. This is something we're showing up more and more in our K-12 design that we do. The notion of not having a teacher own a room necessarily, but rather that there's a professional office type environment where they have an office, but it's much smaller than a 900 square foot classroom that during their prep and conference period would otherwise be underutilized. This is something perhaps we can move to temporarily to help reclaim some of that capacity that's going on.
Yeah. Yeah, exactly. And so what Paul has offered is going to share the spreadsheet, and that's going to help you determine where are you? Is it 44? Is it 60? Is it 70? What is your number that you are comfortable working with to start with? Then what you need to do is then you need to apply it to the room. And as he said here, I'm kind of jumping over him, but he and I used to talking over each other all the time and doing our work.
We finish each other's sentences.
Exactly. But you really, ideally, you want to look at the individual modeling of the room, but you can start, sort of your middle of the road is at least know the square feet of each room to understand what its actual capacity could be. If you have that in your floor plan.
This is something like in a matter of hours. If you have a comprehensive inventory of all your spaces, particularly if you have space associated with it, such as just square feet of the space, or even better, the length and width of each room. If you've done a facility assessment and have a database with this stuff, it's a real simple exercise, and I would offer up just as a gratis assist to your planning for reopening. We can do that seriously in a matter of hours. It's just a matter of applying the math to your databases if you so want, or if you just wanted some consultation, you can do it on your own.
Yeah. So, all right. So here's how it applies. So you all saw this spreadsheet this image last week. For those of you who were on it, this is a digitized floor plan of an elementary school, and this is one of our clients we've worked with in the past. Digitized this floor plan. Of these spaces, 25 of these spaces get capacity now. And so what I just modified from last week is highlighting that these are 25 spaces now. And the current enrollment is current enrollment's 480, capacity is 570. So you're currently utilized at 84%, but when we reduce that capacity by 60% to start with, you get down to a capacity of 342 or 140% utilized. And so the knee-jerk reaction may be, well, I can't educate all the kids here. I don't have enough space. Well, if you recapture spaces that are currently used as pull-out rooms and say, you know what, we need to do pull-out differently, or we're not going to use the computer lab anymore for computer lab. We're not going to, which a lot of folks aren't anyway now. We can't fit everybody in the cafeteria, and so we're going to have that as a space. We can't do all of our pullouts like we have been doing, and so we're going to recapture those spaces for capacity. Well, now I went from 25 teaching stations to 47. So now my capacity, even after I initially factor it down 60%, jumps up to over 800. I have more than enough space. Now you have to staff it, right? And that's part of the discussion moving forward. But this is all looking at, I planned this based on a 44 using the lower end of the model. But if you went higher, that number, if you were using 60, it might be 700, 650. You still have more than enough space. Okay, well then the next step is, all right, so I got more capacity than I needed. Now I'm going to back out those spaces that are least optimal for instruction and still giving me enough space. So I got down to 39 teaching stations. So that's the kind of the process. Start with what you have, do a maximum theoretical capacity based upon gobbling up the spaces that you could use as an assigned space. See what that number is using your square foot model of choice. Is it 44? Is it 60? Is it whatever it is? And then you come back down to sort of a prioritized COVID capacity. So that's the logic flow. If you have comments, we're going to do our breakout session on this topic, but if you have questions on that topic, and just feel free to fire it off as we go here. So bus capacity. Bus capacity is the other elephant that we have to deal with in the room. How do we get kids there? It's fine if we can teach them how we get them there. Well, I think Mary, you were going to speak to this one a little bit, but first, the problem is not going to be the same everywhere. And go ahead, Mary. Okay.
Sorry, I was on mute.
There you go.
Yeah, thanks, David. No, what was really interesting to me was I'm in the District of Columbia. The kids take public transportation or walk, or their parents take them. But, you know, hearing from a lot of other districts and states a major concern about school bus transport. And I know that it is, but I was actually surprised that more kids weren't taking the school buses. And this was the Highway Administration does an annual survey of 5 to 17-year-olds and how do they get to school, and they pick a day and they survey it anyway. So what they do for the last 10 years is that essentially 64% of almost 65% of kids are either in private vehicles or walking or biking, and that the kids on the public transportation, whether it's the public school district transportation or public transit, is only about 35%. So now that's a lot of kids. That's, you know, 16, 17 million children. But it's obviously not going to be distributed equally, right? It's not going to be in every district. It's 2/3, 1/3. So it's not to in any way underestimate what the challenges are with the buses. But I was struck by that essentially already 65% of the kids going to public school go in some kind of socially distanced method, you know, either walking, biking, or in their home vehicle. So anyway, that was just a sort of a context for us. And then I think, Paul, you were going to show us what you all have been looking at in terms of school buses. Oh, well, this is what I've been collecting, sort of what were some of the protocols on the buses, and you know, everything from kids are sanitizing their hands before they go in. There's plexiglass protecting the driver. Students have to wear masks to get onto the bus. The driver has to wear a mask. This next one I actually thought was a terrible idea, but it was, I think in Australia, the driver was checking the temperatures of the children before they entered the bus. It just seemed like a bad idea, but I thought it was interesting because no telling what, you know, some of these items, you know, some guidance might be. And I thought it struck me. You know, obviously disinfecting the bus between routes, socially distancing, which Paul's going to talk about. I think it was in Durham. I think Julius is on the phone, but Matthew had said, well, if family members are sitting together, you might be able to increase the capacity of the bus. And maintaining the bus. This is the other thing, that in order to do better tracing, that the bus driver was having to keep very strict logs on who was on the bus at which time for the contact tracing. Obviously, even if all kids were in a school, staggering the routes so that kids are entering the building, not all at the same time. So it's not like school starts at 8:30, so everybody's got to be there.
Right.
You can't get into the building except at staggered times. So all of these things are you know, really complicated issues for your transportation systems.
Yeah, bus drivers going to want to raise now.
Well,
so,
I'm sure they deserve it. Average salary, $16 an hour. I think they deserve it.
All right, Paul, give us a quick overview of this one here.
When we started looking at space and looking at those, you know, nose to nose versus kind of a 9-foot grid type modeling, what would that look like on a bus? And it was kind of a cathartic moment of, okay, you lose 88% of the bus capacity if you're being pure with it. You know, trying to find some guidance out of our federal government, CDC, saying that you should still maintain 6 feet even when you're wearing a mask. It begs the question, is it reasonably safe and healthy to pack them on even at 50% capacity, like the lower image shows there? It's a tough challenge to solve. Yeah.
The 88%, that's a tough pill to swallow, I think, in everyone. And looking at that, I know has had a gut check, I'm sure. And so looking at what do we do for that, you know, can we just have PPE requirements? There are a lot of good comments coming up here on the chat about, you know, like from, you know, we don't even know if how many parents will be comfortable putting their kids on the bus. So part of this demand may be cut down significantly just because parents who have the capacity to transport may. What that's going to cause, as other folks have noted, increased congestion. So what do you got to do? We've got to look at, that's going to impact your onboarding and exiting of students. So what do we need? Some lengthier times there. We need some staging. Those are the kind of scheduling things we're going to get into starting next week, is how do we start to operationalize the thought. We wanted to first start with how many kids can we educate at a time and where can we do that? That's the first question. And then how do we do that? In what period? How do we work with time? Then that feeds off of our capacity, just like any kind of facility planning or strategic planning. Okay. So budging, I know we're kind of flying through here. We wanted to get through the introduction of topics, and then we're going to get to some conversation. And as Mary is going over the budgeting worksheet here and showing you a summary of what you're going to receive next week, I'm going to go back and look through the chats, and we'll have a brief large group chat about some of the topics we've been discussing, and we'll break into small groups here in a little bit.
All right. Can you hear me, David?
Yep.
Yeah. Okay. So we have been working from it's an iterative process of looking at what are the key elements in a reopening plan. So we're planning for the personal hygiene requirements and protocols, whether it's masks or gloves or hand washing. So there's a whole element of things that we've been looking at and trying to understand, what's most important, what's, for whom, when, how many times. And then we've been looking at the cleaning of the building and surfaces, and have really at this point, truthfully, have had the least we've been paying attention to, but have the least information and clarity on air quality, although it's clear that air is one of the most critical elements of transmitting the disease. And it seems to be more than surfaces, but, and obviously, except social distancing is really about the air. So we've been looking at, the health and hygiene protocols, the cleaning protocols, and social distancing protocols. And initially, we started out trying to understand sort of costs, sort of the cost to closing and responding to COVID. But in some ways, we've switched our focus to what does it look like to operate under a kind of health crisis environment, figuring that it's going to be at least the school year 2021 when there will be these requirements in place, and could easily fall into 21, 22. So what we've been doing is trying to understand what are if you're following the guidance that you've been given, what are your costs going to be? And the big categories is that we think there's a whole element of communications and planning that need to have. They're actually pretty cheap, but they're probably two of the most important things that you could do in terms of building trust in your community and making sure that you're not implementing guidance that might be very high cost and low return. Staffing is obviously one of the most expensive things, and part of what we're assuming in here is that when you're in the middle of a health crisis, you increase your health personnel on site, and you're given that hygiene is a part of this health crisis, that your custodians would also be staff that would be increased on site because the requirements for them are going to be much higher. Obviously, there is equipment and supplies associated with all of this, and we're trying to get a handle on that. And then but understand, which is a little bit terrifying, but that we have not included in this, although it's in the worksheet, but in this sort of first pass, we have not included any additional costs for instructional staff, for technology, or other off-site learning costs, whether it's in feeding programs or in instruction. So this is really just sort of operating under a COVID environment from a very, kind of, again, plant operational perspective, and it's meant to be the marginal difference, not the total cost of operating, but the marginal difference. And what we've estimated is that we think it adds about $375 a student to the cost of operating. And David, let's just move on to the next slide, and you can see why I think it's going to be better to do as homework rather than right now. But what you can see is this is in a spreadsheet that will, I don't know whether you've uploaded it, David, or you'll send it out.
I'm gonna modify it to give you a very simple user interface to this, and then I'll send it out next week.
Yeah, that's right. I remember you said that. So the idea is that there are going to be the things to work with, because you'll be able to change this. Is, are you working, is your unit the district? So it's like when you're talking about engaging some planning, some technical help, it might be you say, no, I don't need it. I've got the capacity in-house, and that's great. Otherwise, you can plug it in there, and it should be a low cost, and you can just multiply. You're going to do it once, and it'll have that one cost. But so that you can see, for example, on what I did here is I took a district. It was a small district in Alabama, actually, that I had information on. It's 17 schools. It's got about 1.1 million square feet of space. And so if you need at least one more custodian per school, you've got 17 schools, you're multiplying. Now, these custodian prices are fully loaded, and they're DC. So it might look less in Alabama, and you would change those numbers, and then you'll get your total cost sort of along the side. And so we were looking at staffing, supplies, hand sanitizer. If you've got if half of your kids or so are riding the bus, and before they go into the bus they've got to wash their hands, they're going to have to do it. You figure for 180 days it actually costs 2 cents, thanks to Jerry Roseman, who calculated this for me, to wash your hands. It's 22,000. And it's a lot of Purell.
A lot of gel.
So a lot of gel. And these masks, if you are requiring all of your school staff to wear masks, again, these all add up. So what we're trying to do is set up a grid for you to begin to think through, and there should be things added. There'll be things that you can zero out, and we would really be interested in sort of crowdsourcing some of this in order to get a better handle on it. One of the things that, all of this is basically operational. There are capital projects that might also benefit schools that are having to operate under a really tight hygienic protocols. So sensors, replacing faucets with, hand sensors. And I would encourage each of the states and districts to also kind of have a menu of capital projects. On the main sheet, we have many of those, and there will be others that you would want to add. But I think that it begins to get us there. And when I did this for, using, 100,000 schools and 50 million children, it ended up at about $13 billion just for these sort of minimal requirements.
That's not extra staff. That's not extra teachers. That's not mobilizing your
no, it's not teachers.
Your substitute teacher force, because you now need additional staff at the ready, and you need them already background checked, that kind of stuff.
Right. The only addition, it is additional custodians and it is additional nurses. And what we saw in a recent study was that only about half of all schools have a full-time nurse, and 82% had a nurse at least full or part-time. But that meant about 18,000 schools didn't even have any medical kind of person on staff. And there's so much training, there's so much monitoring, information, all kinds of things that are going to be taking place in these schools. I think from the perspective of the National Council, having some medical educators and staff people in the building is going to be really, really critical to the confidence of the community.
Yeah, and
Go ahead,
a couple points on that, right? So we are going to give you this tool and have the different levers that you can pull based upon your assumptions of size and frequency of doing these different kinds of things. So you can model it what you think, and then also do let us know. We've worked through and we've gotten feedback from you from this group before, but if there's other details that might be missing, and I see some folks coming in, liability insurance, when you look at increased cost for liability insurance, does that matter? I know Guy's been sending a lot of work from that.
So what, David, let me just say something about the liability, because Guy from Idaho had some interesting feedback for us. And I don't know, Guy, are you there? Can you unmute Guy?
Yes, I am.
Why don't you share with folks what you learned about the insurance associated with the viruses and other pollutants?
What I did was looked at our major liability carrier in Idaho and asked what the district or what the industry standard was. Basically, there is an exception for viral impact. Talking to the vice president of this regional company, he said that they would turn it in, but it would be denied. That the effect, the basic effect here is we have no liability insurance for anything that is virally related, which creates that standard of care responsibility. If we have a standard of care and move in a herd, we're much better off than if we're making it up on our own. That's just the liability issue is huge. Right,
and I think that's really part of what the National Council on School Facilities is trying to do by kind of helping to facilitate this, is to get some guidance that is common, clear, concise, uniform, common, that it is a kind of liability protection in and of itself. And one of the things for folks here to know is that we reached out to the National Academies of Science, and they have agreed to review any of the sort of items that we're looking at here from a public health perspective. And so, because what we'd like to do is to have guidance that can be standardized. It's not that when it's implemented, it doesn't look very different depending upon where you are and what your conditions are, but that there is actually real guidance. And I think that we will provide some protection to states and districts, from this process.
Yeah, that's one of the things we've noticed is that there is, something of a passing of the buck down to the local decision maker, which is why so many of us are scrambling for what do I do? Where's the guidance? So we're trying to push back and create something as a unit, as a team that we can agree is a good baseline. So some of the things I'm looking through the comments here, lots of good operational questions, liability insurance being one, from Dr. Contreras in Guilford, North Carolina. North Carolina has a shortage of 20,000 nurses. Well, you can't get you can't just, put an ad up and get a nurse overnight necessarily. So high demand right now in particular. So what other strategies could a district employ if you don't have access to enough nurses? That's a fantastic question. What about, what's the frequency of deep clean that we need to budget for? That's a question we need to assume in our model. Let's see, and other things, meals, where are you going to serve? How are you going to do that? All operational stuff that we need to dive into next week. And the most, sort of at the center of all this is, of course, how are you going to pay for all those people? And one of the things that we believe needs to be done in this work is to show up to legislators, particularly on the Hill right now, that this is what's being asked of school districts, and this is what's going to cost, at least at a gross order of magnitude. Districts need federal assistance to make this work, because states are going to losing their revenue. So we've got to get some assistance from the top. Mary, did I say that right?
Yep.
Okay.
Well, it's going to take the whole family. That's what I say.
Absolutely.
Everybody at the table.
Right. Exactly.
Everybody at the table.
Okay. So we're at the point in the presentation here where we're going to get into small groups and talk about capacity. Did want to raise Bob Gorell's question. That is a good one, because in the space there from Maryland, Bob, you asked about, is the maximum of 10 in a space not being considered in any of this? That is a great question. And looking at it, one of the assumptions that we were working with is if, not all spaces are created equal, and that if a 700 square foot space with adequate ventilation can hold 10, what about a 2,000 square foot space? What about a science lab? What about a larger classroom? Does the size of the classroom matter? And we're proceeding with the assumption that it does, to a point. That one of the things that we also need to go back and look at this from the operational standpoint is the airflow issue. And that's part of why when we get to that kind of scientific questions about, disease spread and so forth, that is out of particularly Mary and my wheelhouse, and that's where in many of our wheelhouses. So that's where we're looking at the National Academy of Sciences to provide some guidance on top. And what we believe here is we're going to proceed. Folks will practically proceed with a COVID capacity of their buildings, go through, start the operational planning accordingly. And if you run into a snag or some other guidance that then makes your existing capacity void and you need to go back and change it, then you just go back, repeat the process. And unfortunately, that might have to happen in some cases here. Just seeing how the stuff is changing so quickly. Mary, did you want to comment more, or Bob, did you want to speak up on that point?
Well, first, I just want to say that there's a different Robert Gorel. I see there's two Robert Gorels, so this would be somebody else.
Oh, sorry. All right.
Well, the only thing that I would say on the 10, one of the pieces that we're working on here is that none of this happens in a vacuum. It happens as it relates to the community transmission and what the advice is coming from your governors and county health officials, and so the no more than 10 meeting and no more than 10 is a high. It's kind of the lockdown. It's the lockdown recommendation in Washington D.C. certainly for that you can't have more than 10 people together. So I would assume that in a school reopening, but it may not be. This is again part of there's a little bit of a lack of clarity on this. It's like, can you open a school and have more than 10 people congregating, and somehow you can't have a school with more than 9 children and an adult in a class. So I think that we certainly have been proceeding as though that maximum were not in effect if the schools are going to be open. If you're that locked down, you're not opening the schools.
Yeah.
Maryland, hey, Mary, Bob Gorel in Maryland. I absolutely
agree. Hey, Bob.
This would be a later phase Again, I don't know who the other Robert Gorel is. He probably wants to jump in on that, but I think that once we start the reopening and social distancing is not so severe, what we've seen around the country are 50% occupancies, 60% occupancies. There's going to be various levels. It'll be a local governance question. But I agree. From what I'm seeing, it won't be 10 people per room once we start reopening.
And again, yeah, absolutely. And that goes back to the point in the beginning here. Why social distancing? One is to limit the potential spread between folks, and then to limit the potential groups of folks from potentially, exposing other groups. Why? So that as many kids as safely possible can continue to get educated, because that's important in their schools. And I agree that the 10 student thing across the board, if that's the case, the sort of the logical implications of doing that to scale are such that it would seem not to be possible, really, unless you're going to very, very aggressive schedule changes, which then nullify having kids in school on a regular basis. And that's a challenge. Okay, so Jeff, can we talk more about staggered schedules? Absolutely. That is something we need to do, and that's what we are preparing to do next week. Unfortunately, we're not prepared to talk about that this week. We wanted to get done with the capacity conversation and then move from that into what are the different schedule options that are out there and what's real. One of the things we definitely want this group in the small group conversations is what's real. There's a lot of theoretical stuff out there from folks who are doing calculations and spreadsheets in their head, but what's real from a practical standpoint for those who operate schools. So, right, I think now is a good time for us to look to pivot and move into our small group. We are just shy of 4 o'clock Eastern Standard. And our request last week from you all was to extend the time a little bit to up to 90 minutes. So we are going to break in. For those of you who are able to hang on in small group conversation, please do. For those of you who are not able to or choose not to, I very much appreciate the feedback you've provided in chat. This presentation, as soon as we're get done here, no later than tomorrow morning, will be sent out to everybody who registered, who attended here. Along with, we have a YouTube channel where we are putting up these recordings that have the chat that flows along with it. So you can see the chat pop up as we talk here. So I'll send the link to that YouTube channel for all of our webinars with the presentations there. So you can see them every week. You can see the previous ones as well. Okay, so now our focus question, as you recall from the top of the agenda here. What concerns do you have about being able to develop, communicate, and implement a Corona capacity with your community? You have started to fill those in. I want to emphasize one phrase in here: with your community. One of our assumptions as well is that no capacity is going to work if it's not trusted. I saw that from Michael Elliott posting there in Oregon, how something to the effect of, how do I make this capacity something that my stakeholders will actually accept at the local level? Well, one of the assumptions is we really do believe that this is a kind of work that, even though it's tough, to involve your community in some way, so that there is some shared work in developing it, shared work in communicating it, and shared work in implementing it, so that it is a us thing, not a them thing. It is a community driven thing. Mary, do you want to underscore any points there before we move on?
Yeah, just essentially we are all making risk judgments about the health of ourselves and our families and our children. In my case, it's grandchildren in the public schools. And there's just no way that the system works without the trust and the confidence of the communities and families. And in this very uncertain environment, there's no shortcut for getting that other than communicating with the them openly and engaging them in the problem solving. And I know there's a tendency, not to offend my great partners in planning and design, but there's a tendency to, to have an elegant, solution with all of the lovely drawings but it's not the same as when the people who are going to have to live that say, well, okay, how would this work? Where would my kid enter?
Mm-hmm.
Where do I enter if I want to come in and into the school? Can I go into the school? I mean, one of the things I was looking at recently said, they would not allow parents in the schools. Well, maybe you need to talk about that, and maybe you need to talk about what does that mean to have the community be able to come into the school. So I think that you want to leave the time for that, because it can take time. But I think that the support and of the community and the parents for what's going on is going to be absolutely critical.
Yeah,
and it'll make all the difference in the world.
So as we are going to break into small groups now, and one of the things that are popping up in the chat, and I want to highlight it because it's important. We talked about capacity of the building, but we also recognize that there's a campus out there. Not every space has green space. Not every school has fields and so forth, but a lot of us do. A lot of schools, districts do out there. And can you realistically activate your campus green space, get kids outside? Paul and I, for a while, lived next to each other. Our kids went to school for a while in a big tent, kind of folksy for a while. It can work. So can we use some outdoor space as well as indoor space? I'm going to break us into small groups of 5 to 6 participants in a room. If you need to jet, totally understand, and thank you. Hopefully we see you next week and continue the conversation. If you're able to stick around, please do. And we will, what we're aiming to do is to dive deeper in these small group conversations than we can as a large group on what are some of the capacity heartburn that you have right now about getting this done. And then we're going to come back. We're going to give it 15 minutes in the small group, come back, and we're going to wrap it up. So I'm going to break us into rooms here of, about 6-ish. You're going to see up in your meeting room, you're going to see an invitation to join a small group room. So you've been invited. Feel free, break out into that room. I will call all of us back. Don't worry about how to do that. It'll just happen here in about 15 to no more than 20 minutes. Okay, so appreciate everybody sticking around for the deeper dive in conversation here. If you remember your group number, there's too many for us to go all the way through in the remaining time here. I want to be respectful of everybody's time. So in the last few minutes, I'm just going to pick out a handful of numbers. Group, say group 1, those of you who are in group 1, if you remember that, could you just unmute and tell us a little bit about what you were talking about? Volunteers. Well, I'll tell you what, let me go another path, but I can see folks, maybe let's just ask Scott. I'm going to pick on you, Scott Lindberger. Could you unmute, tell us a little bit about what your group conversation was about?
Jeffrey said he was going to speak for us, so I didn't want to steal his thunder.
Well, you can voluntold him.
Real nice. Throwing me under the bus that we can't find a driver for.
It's an empty bus, but it's okay.
So I mean, it was a great way to commiserate. The number of common problems is phenomenal, despite the differences in size and location. But one of the common things that we talked about is, as operational leads, we can figure out the space. Going back to the conversation before we split, it's how are they going to teach, and how are they going to have enough teachers to cover all the kids and get the education done. That's, we talked a lot about that.
Yeah. Thanks. Let's see. Letty, I see you in my screen there. Do you want to elaborate on your group's conversation? You can unmute, please.
We were from 3 very different type areas, and yet there were commonalities that we found as well. Transportation, for the different reasons we do it, is designed to do the opposite of what we're being asked to do. So that's one of the particularly difficult challenges, because if we don't get the kids there on our transportation, a lot of our populations will simply not go to school. And so that's very problematic for us. We talked a bit about leadership and how we can lead through. I think it's going to be important for the national level teachers unions to help them play ball with us, that we're going to have to reinvent this. And to fight that battle individually, every single school is going to be really, really tough. We didn't talk about that a lot, but we talked about how hard it is to do the negotiations that are going to be required in the different scheduling and cleaning requirements for classrooms and things like that.
Excellent point. You know, the commonalities of challenges is what we want to make sure that we speak to in the guidance. And I think a lot of you were sharing common themes in the chat, so that's going to help, you know, us push through. And as we conclude here and send emails out, if you have particular thoughts of operational issues that you want us to address beyond, you know, what you put in the chat box today, please do that via email. Let's conclude, you know, with one more. Let's see, Cheryl Hunt, I'm going to pick on you there. I see you there. Could you share a little bit about your group, and then we're going to get to close here.
Absolutely. In our group, we shared probably the most important thing before getting to the capacity conversation, which I know in our district, we are having those initial conversations right now with the capacity to receive students and opening our schools. But the most important thing is building that community trust, and that we're extremely transparent with what it means to bring our kids back in this fashion of a face-to-face model, and what that'll look like in the classroom, and how we're going to ensure their safety, and how we will pivot in the event that we have a student that does end up becoming positive for COVID. And so what does that mean for our schools? So being able to really put together a solid, clear communication plan that is shared with our stakeholders in our communities, and giving that reassurance and trust to our families, that was really paramount on what we shared. We did spend some time. I was able to share a sample of the capacity document that we put together. We also, Sheila Hoopman was fabulous in sharing some classroom diagrams of what it could look like using the CDC recommendations within a classroom setting, and how many of us have used our educational setting to really have collaborative, cooperative group settings and really rich dialogues in terms of the academic front. And now to set up a classroom that really goes opposite of what we've all been doing with the creative spaces, and going back to that, you know,
it's a shame,
more traditional when we were in school type of model, just that shift in, and helping get our teachers to wrap around what that'll look like, from all of the collaboration and the investment and professional development that we've done for our staff, and how to shift in that manner. So thoughtful. It was great to have that breakout session. So thank you.
Yeah. And that's a real shame of the, you know, the hard pivot away from all of the kind of collaborative work, group work, project-based learning, you know, moving from the sage on the stage model. And this very much impacts that, you know, and making it a stopgap measure, not a return to norm. It's going to be a national effort. So big things here is you got an amen from Tom on that in the chat, I saw. One of the themes, trust from staff, trust from community. How are we going to pay for the increased transportation costs? How are we going to pay for and hire? Who are we going to hire, and how are we going to pay for them to socially distance if we don't radically change our schedules so that we keep our staff and kids just get less face time? That's the paradigm. is beyond, from what I'm hearing from the groups here, beyond those. Oh, and one other is everybody's going to have to do more in a age appropriate, role appropriate way, but everybody's going to have to do a little bit more. Beyond those like 4 things, is there some major operational issue that you want to shout out before we close and move into next week?
Well,
So,
the only thing I
David-
might add, and
Go ahead.
Letty brought it up right at the end of our group, is campus security. That
Oh, true.
that
Absolutely.
campus security, all the things that we're talking about to spread out students, including outside, are some of the things that we've been getting away from, because of campus security concerns and
Yep.
and the weird dynamic that we talked about right at the end of ours was, some of the things we have been doing to protect against active shooter, like security bubbles, layered entry, that also helps us with a COVID world. But some of the, we don't do metal detectors in schools, in part because of the bottlenecks at the doors. But now we're talking about taking kids' temperatures at doors, which gives us the same security problem that we had. So I think that as we go forward, we've got competing, and I think Letty said it really well, and it's something for us to think about. And maybe one of these should be geared towards campus security. It's going to be a pick your risk
That's
environment,
great
which is
point.
it's a Sophie's choice that nobody wants. So thank you, and thank you, David. Thank you to Cooperative Strategies.
Yeah, good to see you again. The tension with security, huge. Julius, even masks can be a security concern. And
Right.
I don't know, having my 6-year-old wear a mask all day, they're going to be touching their face all day.
One issue that we talked about, Dave, was the fact that in Idaho, 35% of our teaching staff would fall in the high risk category.
Oh, true.
We've got a huge group of people that we have to look at how we're going to protect them as well.
That's a good question. Yeah.
And this is where I think, Letty's comment too, in terms of getting all of the various union folks kind of working in a very much a collaborative problem solving way, is we really need to find that table and space and make sure that we're all listening really well, because there's a lot being asked of the custodians, of the teachers, as you say, if, third of them are in the high risk space, and then we're saying, okay, you all are the front lines, you take the temperatures, no nurses, you guys do it, you guys clean and wipe down the desks if we don't have enough custodians, you guys, take on all this other work and risk. And, and by the way, we're going to freeze your salary or cut your benefits or take away your pension, So, I think those are things that, we all will need to navigate pretty quickly.
Yeah.
Mary, can I make a 30-second comment about that?
Go for it.
Yeah, absolutely, Jerry.
Working for a large union and with some of the national unions, and having a cousin that works with a teachers learning committee here in Philadelphia. She just retired. I shared some of what we've been doing with her and asked if teachers in Philadelphia that she knows about are thinking about any of these issues. She said no. She had no idea about any of it, actually. I was surprised. She said it's because teachers are struggling right now with delivering educational content now.
Yeah.
And so they haven't had time to turn their attention. But she did share like 30 different, very specific kinds of things I'll send over to you from teachers, the 30 teachers that were really interesting and very much like this. These are the issues we have to grapple with. That's true.
Awesome. Thanks, Jerry.
Sure.
Yeah, that's good.
Yeah.
They call something I heard on, there's a cash call earlier today with California, and the notion of sticking the landing of this year is so critically important to any sort of relaunch, re-entry back into our atmosphere. Saying back to school in the fall, it's not really back to school. It's back under the same roof, because we're still in school right now. School hasn't stopped. We're struggling.
Yeah. So.
And that brings up, I was on Paul's little group, and at the end, we just started a discussion, because the premise behind this call to some degree is that there's a strong bias towards getting kids back to a facility, students, getting people together. And so we're looking at all these facility questions. And he just brought up the parent interest of agency, and maybe,
right.
5 or 10% of our parents who whatever we do won't like it. And it might be not just the big districts, but the small and medium need to have more than one option. And I think that's really tough to put your head around, because very large systems, maybe they can have their own online, maybe they already have it, but how, not just the ability to pivot if things change, but just from the get-go, we probably, none of us can have something that's going to work for like 100% of our constituents. That's a huge.
That's a great point, Doug. Is as much as we can try to build flexibility in different decision trees right now for what strategy you choose, it's not going to be a strategy. It's going to have to be a strategies. It's going to have to be like a couple things at least at the same time. I heard somebody mentioned, I don't know if it was you, Guy, or somebody in a previous one, about our teachers who are at risk. Maybe those are the teachers who are dedicated on the online learning.
That's how we're approaching it.
Yeah, exactly. So, all right, so let's start. If that's a known, how does that start planning that now? What are we learning? What's working? What's not? Summer's going to be busy.
And the critical needs of the younger students for daycare, for food insecurity, and in some of these districts, Montgomery County and DC, the students rely on the school system for food, sometimes breakfast, lunch, and dinner. So getting that, even though those things are being provided now, not in an ideal way, perhaps it's getting those students back into the same building. Well, it's a little easier for the older high school students, for example, to continue to distance learn for a while.
Yeah. And those, as Julia says, those kindergartens can't watch themselves while their parents at work.
Right.
Amen.
I'd argue that the 14-year-olds have a tough time at it too.
Yeah, absolutely. And to the other point is there the kindergartner is, if you enforce strict social distancing in a classroom for a kindergartner, enforcing that to the T with the 6-year-old does not create an environment you want a 6-year-old to be in. Getting qualitative on this discussion a little bit, and that's challenging. And that's kind of where we see is like when we look at social distancing in the classroom here, it's 2 variables, not just the one. There's the limiting exposure within a group, but there's also accepting that within a group there's going to be relative high exposure within that group relative. And what you're trying to do is then limit the groups as they go through, so that if there is an infection, it impacts the least number of kids, the least number of students, least number of staff, and that's the operational thing. When we look at, once we create some capacity models, how would we make those pieces move so that we can be relatively human within our groups, but not unnecessarily expose groups to groups. And
so I think we're at almost 4:40.
Yeah, we're done.
So I think we're good, and we've got a lot of work to do between now and next week, David. So
we do.
I really appreciate the input. It's fantastic, and thank you all for all the work that you're doing out there, on this.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you, everybody.
See you next week.
Look for email. It's coming.
Take care.
Take care.
Bye-bye.
Thanks all.